Russia's rail map has a strange quirk. On one of the core east-west arteries, trains briefly leave Russia, pass through northern Kazakhstan near Petropavlovsk, and then re-enter Russia. In peacetime, that's just a paperwork hassle. In a sanctions era, it's a strategic vulnerability. That's why Moscow has been studying and in some regions preparing for a domestic bypass that keeps trains entirely on Russian soil. Between the Urals and western Siberia, legacy Soviet rail alignments mean the shortest, flattest path cuts a corner through Kazakhstan. That corner sits around the Petropavlovsk rail hub on a corridor linking the Volga-Urals to Omsk and Novosibirsk. Multiple Russian planning documents describe a proposed 585-kilometer line through the Kurgan, Tyumen, Omsk, and Novosibirsk regions, often named by its key nodes like Konovalovo, Nazivyi-Evskaya, Tatarsk. The new line would eliminate that foreign detour and create a second trunk around congested Omsk. Every time a Russian freight or passenger train dips into Kazakhstan, it's exposed to another state's laws, border rules, and potential leverage. Even with friendly relations, border formalities, and rail administration differences add friction. A full Russian bypass removes a geopolitical weak point on the country's main land bridge from European Russia to Siberia and the Far East. This isn't unprecedented. In 2017, Russia opened the Juravka-Milerovo bypass to avoid a short section of railway crossing Ukraine. The logic is identical: reduce reliance on foreign soil for core infrastructure. Omsk is a notorious choke point. The bypass isn't only about avoiding Kazakhstan, it's also designed as a parallel trunk to offload the Omsk junction. By adding double track capacity, the new route can handle higher freight volumes without squeezing through a single urban bottleneck. More tracks, fewer at-grade conflicts, and no international handovers mean faster average speeds and more reliable schedules. Since 2022, Russia's railways have shouldered an even larger share of domestic and Eurasian cargo. At the same time, Kazakhstan and China are accelerating alternative trade routes, the so-called Middle Corridor, across the Caspian that deliberately bypass Russian territory. The more those corridors grow, the greater Russia's incentive to harden and streamline its own backbone. Removing a foreign kink is part of that hardening. Kazakhstan today is a pragmatic partner, but it's also building its own bypasses and capacity upgrades to attract transit flows independent of Russia. Moscow has to assume that tomorrow's political winds might change. A domestic bypass ensures that no matter what happens, Russia retains full control over its east-west rail lifeline. Open source information describes a 585-kilometer double-track electrified line crossing 4 Russian oblasts: Kurgan, Tyumen, Omsk, and Novosibirsk. Built to trunk line standards, it's framed as 2 solutions in one. Ensure that passenger and freight traffic no longer needs to touch Petropavlovsk in Kazakhstan. Create a high-capacity freight ring to relieve Omsk. Even though public documentation is limited, the recurring technical aims, domestic routing, Omsk relief, added throughput are consistent across Russian rail industry sources. The advantages of this bypass stack up quickly. Operational continuity. Eliminating one international boundary crossing removes customs checks and bilateral coordination delays. That saves thousands of train hours every year. Resilience. A second trunk gives dispatchers alternatives in case of accidents, maintenance, or surges in traffic. Efficiency. Dedicated freight geometry and fewer urban conflicts allow longer, heavier trains, lowering the cost per ton kilometer. Economic security. Western Siberia's oil, gas, timber, and metals industries rely on rail. A domestic bypass ensures these flows aren't vulnerable to another country's border rules. Military logistics. Rail is the backbone of Russian military transport. A secure, all-Russian route is a straightforward strategic necessity. Of course, there are trade-offs. The price tag is huge. Early estimates put the project at hundreds of billions of rubles, and inflation plus electrification and bridge works make it even costlier today. Russia is already spending heavily on other mega projects like the Northern Latitudinal Railway and the expansion of the BM and Trans-Siberian corridors. Then there are environmental permits, land acquisition, and integration with existing yards and power systems. A bypass is only as useful as the connections at each end, meaning heavy coordination across multiple regions. Still, the precedent of the 2017 Ukraine bypass shows that Russia can deliver complex reroutes when the strategic need is clear. Look at the neighborhood. Kazakhstan is pushing hard to position itself as a Eurasian transit hub. China is promoting new corridors to Europe that bypass Russia entirely. And sanctions continue to make Russia more reliant on secure domestic infrastructure. If Moscow wants the Trans-Siberian Railway to remain the dominant artery for east-west flows, it needs reliability that doesn't depend on foreign borders. That's what this bypass buys, not necessarily higher speeds, but guaranteed control. This is not about nostalgia or prestige, it's about risk management. Russia's new railway bypass is designed to solve a very specific vulnerability: the brief detour into Kazakhstan that leaves its east-west lifeline dependent on another country's goodwill. By eliminating that detour, relieving Almask's bottleneck and future-proofing capacity, Moscow gains a safer, more resilient backbone. In an era where every country is building alternatives to reduce dependence, Russia is doing the same.